Hey everybody! So this is Time to Be Reasonable with Frank Perkins, and today I am going to be discussing the pro-freedom approach to infectious disease, preparing for the next pandemic by Onkar Gates, the senior fellow at Ayn Rand Institute. And if you have anything that you would like to add to this, that's fine. And I'm going to go over this as best I can within 30 minutes, and we'll talk about some other things. And you might notice that I have a TV in the background, and that's because some of you know that I am an avid wrestling fan, and I'm going to probably be watching wrestling in about, I don't know. Oh, Shane McMahon is out there. So I'm not going to pay attention to that too much. But anyway, just going to discuss this. This is some rough stuff to read through because it's a policy brief, and policy briefs are not exactly the fun thing that you get to argue about on Facebook, but they are this is like recommendations. So we're going to talk about some of these recommendations and thoughts on them. And I am going to tell you right now that while I am an objectivist and I am a member of I can't say that. I am an activist that helps out with the Libertarian Party movement. As currently, I do not have a card, and somebody was really making a big deal about that. That was very important. So I don't want to be misleading people and thinking that I am a libertarian Party member with a card and everything. I do not have one because my funding is not at that point yet. But maybe down the road we'll see. Anyway, so I am talking about this brief tonight, and I got this because I participated. I went and watched a seminar talking about COVID and everything, and kind of how to basically the policies of the Ayn Rand Institute with regard to COVID and exactly how they would recommend that it be dealt with. Now, I'm going to talk about my personal beliefs with COVID-19 because I am a I don't know. I didn't want to stop the camera. I was trying to see if there's a way that I could put a background on here. I'll have to figure that out. Maybe. There. All right. So we're gonna. There we go. Just well, that's a blur. We don't want to do that, but I do have some backgrounds that I'll just. How about the background for this lovely concept here? We'll put that on here. And this is the first time that we've done this show, so I figure I would just do this and kind of. Ooh, it's not really. Yeah, it's not going to do that, is it? I guess it's not as good as. There we go. All right. So, oh, well, now I'm not seeable. That's kind of weird. That's not going to work either. Hold on. Sorry that you're actually seeing me do some work right now, but that's kind of some of the things I do sometimes. So we're gonna. Okay, hold on. Okay. We're just gonna. Let's make it so that I'm seeable. The TV. I don't know. Am I still not? I'm still not seeable. It's really weird. Huh. Yeah, that's creepy. We're not going to do that. Just a little bit concerned about the TV is what it is. I don't want to get in trouble for showing wrestling for like 30 minutes or something like that. Let's see here. Gonna have to figure that out, but maybe not today. Let's see. Well, yeah, that's a little bit too. Yeah, that's strange. Oh yeah, so they just you have to have a blue screen. Okay. They don't have like a background like system kind of thing. Oh, I know what I could do. Let's try something. I have an idea. Yep, there we go. All right, so this will work. Yeah, I'm in my rock living room here. All right, so we'll talk now. We'll actually get back to business. Sorry about that, but I wanted to make sure that we were safe and didn't make anybody upset, as sometimes people are more willing to do. But anyway, I wanted to talk about my way of seeing COVID, and I believe that individuals have the ability to make the decision to take care of their loved ones and to act for the benefit of people in general without the government saying that they have to do that. I don't think that's a crazy idea. I don't think that we need to legislate people to wear masks. I think that people can just wear masks. And I think that it is wrong to make people feel bad because they are doing that they are following that suggestion. And I think I've seen that in the Libertarian Party where there's people that basically they equate wearing a mask as having a dildo on your head or something like that. And I don't appreciate that at all. And part of that is because I am susceptible to COVID-19 myself. So I have a 6% more chance of fatality because I have kidney failure. Right here, if you look, I have, you probably can't see it, but that's where I get my dialysis every day. So it's something that I'm actually concerned about, and I don't think that it makes me a coward because I want to follow protocols that'll make my life safer. And I don't think that it's right to make people feel bad because they follow those protocols. But anyway, going further into this, I'm going to be fair. I would suggest that you actually probably go read this or find it. And like I said, I am not endorsing what this says. I'm just saying it was what was brought up here. Let's see, executives. All right, so let's see here. All right, so one, we must demand better from government. Our response to SARS COVID V2 was un-American. In the words of one expert, a SARS-CoV-2 pandemic presents the most pressing infectious disease challenge we have faced in over a century. Our federal and state governments have so far failed the challenge. We dare not meet a second wave of infections, let alone the emergence of another novel disease. With the governmental attitudes, and policies that have presently been guiding us. When a new deadly disease appears, we expect both illness and death. But who expected that for months our federal and state governments would be unable to test for and then isolate contagious individuals? Who expected the chaos and delays in purchasing ventilators and other supplies and simply procuring them from federal stockpiles and U.S. military? Who expected that emergency responders, nurses, doctors, and other brave healthcare workers would be exhausted, infected, sick, and even dead, unable to obtain adequate personal protective equipment and desperately trying to supply their own makeshifts? Homemade masks and repurposed rain gear not excluded. On March 26th, video from an emergency room physician at the center of the outbreak in New York City featured a New York Times story, and now approaching 8 million views, gave voice to what many of us were feeling. Everything is not fine, the doctor said. I don't have the support that I need, and even just the materials that I need physically to take care of my patients. And it's America, and we're supposed to be a first world country. America is not only supposed to be a first world country, we're supposed to be a free country. Who of us expected that the response from our governments to their failure in January, February, and March to test for and isolate contagious individuals and expand healthcare capacity would be to coercively and indefinitely lock us down in our homes, with the consequent destruction to our production, incomes, jobs, and freedom? GDP for the first quarter of 2020 fell 5%, consumer spending fell 7.6%, and spending on durable goods fell 16.2% since the pandemic. Well over 40 million Americans have applied for initial jobless claims. Many people's businesses and livelihoods have been wiped out, their lives shattered. In response to the economic devastation caused by significant by the lockdowns, the federal government passed over $2 trillion worth of spending bills, which obviously is not taxpayer money it had saved for an emergency. Rather, the spending schemes ultimately represent an immense seizure of wealth from some of us who already are less wealthy to transfer it to others. Often we will both victim and profiteer, unable to compute the net result. Though for most of us, it will be negative. Jockeying predictably ensued among individuals, businesses, and state and local governments over who counts politically as a have and who as a have not. The economic destruction will play out for years. And of course, the long-range damage from the lockdowns is not only economic. Schools and universities have been closed, affecting the education of millions of children. Cancer treatments, hip replacements, colonoscopies, and other medical tests and elective procedures have been canceled across the country, downgrading the long-term health of thousands and thousands of Americans. Our nation's response to SARS-CoV-2 pandemic is not worthy of the leader of the free world. It is not an American response, but too many of our elected officials, unwilling to face the massive governmental failures involved, are pretending that it is. It's still there. Okay, good. Panic is not worthy of a leader of the free world. Instead of admitting that our lockdowns were panic reactions to months of inaction, when the needs to test and isolate possible carriers of the virus and increase hospital capacity were being ignored, our elected officials continue to order us around through statewide phased plans for reopening, as though the economy of the country were the government's property, which it could choose to open and close at its discretion. Our current federal and state governments may be unwilling to admit their failures, but we as Americans need to identify those failures. We need to consider what led to those failures and what principles must be instituted to avoid a repeat. We need to think what a more effective pro-freedom approach is, and then demand that our representatives in government implement it. Okay. So that's that's the preface of what was being said. And so I'm going to do a little bit of interpretation, but basically what is said is that the government should have acted faster, and they should have not. Their answer shouldn't have been to do a lockdown, and then they should have had some kind of a setup where our taxes had some kind of emergency fund, but instead the money was just raided, and eventually we'll have to deal with that. The alternative to coercive statewide lockdowns was not 2 million dead. It's common to dismiss opponents of the statewide lockdowns by charging us with the moral crime of evading 2.2 million Americans who, absent any mitigation efforts, were projected to die by the Imperial College epidemical model. It is true that too many people who are purportedly on the side of freedom and who were dismayed by the prospect of statewide lockdowns did react by dismissing or downplaying the threat. Armchair virologists and epidemiologists quickly sprung up to declare that SARS-CoV-2 is just like the seasonal influenza virus, which we should let wash over us as we continue to live our lives as usual. Others stated that there likely would be fewer than 5,000 deaths in the U.S. from COVID-19. Unexplained, of course, was how any of them were in the position to know any of this. Like the initial reactions of too many government officials, this sort of counterreaction is also an evasion. But you can be pro-freedom and anti-lockdowns while simultaneously recognizing that the threat from SARS-CoV-2 is real and that new thought and action are required to reduce the damage and death from the novel virus. To advocate the continued protection of the individual's freedom to think and act when faced with a threat like SARS-CoV-2 is not necessarily code for ignoring the threat. In envisioning the American approach to an infectious disease pandemic, in other words, we must not commit the error of assuming the only form of effective action is coercive governmental action. The assumption is un-American. It is prejudiced. I should look at the camera, sorry. It is prejudiced against freedom. The American experiment is that only free individuals can pursue and achieve their happiness, including their own health. This presumably is why the 2017 guidelines from the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention for an influenza pandemic is severe, even as the 1918 pandemic contained largely voluntary measures. The CDC guidelines respect our rights and freedoms as Americans, apart from localized school closures and bans on unmodified mass gatherings. The non-pharmaceutical interventions contained in the guidelines, NPIs, which is part, are aimed at reducing the patient load on local hospitals to flatten the curve, are voluntary. Just like I was saying, voluntary. When in late February, the CDC warned the country about the seriousness of the novel coronavirus and recommended that we heed the 2017 voluntary guidelines for an influenza pandemic, such as increasing the frequency of hand washing and disinfecting often touched surfaces, we would have taken note, and many of us did. Prior to the coercive statewide lockdowns, many of us were already implementing voluntary NPIs like washing our hands more thoroughly, socially distancing. Restaurants, for example, notified patrons of the steps they were choosing to implement, like spacing out tables and disinfecting them after use to reduce the chance of infection. This kind of voluntary action is what has taken place in Sweden. Its governments did not coercively lock down their citizens. But of course, that has not meant that life goes on in Sweden as before. Many Swedes are voluntarily choosing to engage in some social distancing. Restaurants and other businesses have fewer customers, more people are working from home, and so on. Sweden's hospitals have not been overwhelmed, and as the middle of June, its reported deaths per 1 million residents through higher than that of its neighbors, Finland and Norway, is in the middle range of what lockdown European countries like France, Italy, and Netherlands, Ireland, UK, Belgium are experiencing. Now, one thing I need to point out, this report was written June 21st, 2020. So, mind you, what they're basically saying is if this would have happened, then less, issues would have happened. But also, it should be noted that they weren't implemented that way. And so the numbers are going to be much, much different here. But Sweden should not be our full model for how first world free country meets the challenge from a novel infectious disease. To emphasize that, an American approach to the threat of SARS-CoV-2 would be recognize the need for individuals to remain free to think and act, to continue to work and to live as they judge best. Does not mean government, therefore, should do nothing, that it has no function to perform. That assumption, too, is un-American. In the American system, government has a vital role. In defining that role, our model should be the best aspects of what Taiwan and South Korea have done. In neither country did government focus its coercive power on locking down most of its residents. Instead, in both countries, the focus was on detecting carriers of the virus early by testing and tracking in order to isolate them. Sweden, by contrast, has lacked its vital focus on testing, isolating, and tracking. Think of it this way. The alternatives to the emergence of a novel respiratory virus are not for government to do nothing and then watch the residents inexplicably resign themselves to the new disease, continue to live their lives unchanged, or for the government to coercively lock down almost everything and everyone in their homes. We must not allow our thinking to be trapped by this obviously false alternative. So, what does that mean? We need to legally specify a threshold for when infectious diseases qualify as active threats. Infectious disease, of course, is an ongoing aspect of human existence. Chickenpox, polio, smallpox, and the common cold, cholera, malaria, yellow fever, tuberculosis, influenza, and more. Recently, AIDS, Ebola, Zika, and now COVID-19 are illnesses with which we must contend. For non-infectious diseases like cancer or diabetes, government has no. Each of us, in consultation with doctors and other chosen experts, must decide what treatments, if any, to pursue and whether to take preventative measures to reduce our chances of developing the disease in the first place, such as changes in diet and exercise. The costs, the risks, and rewards are ours to assume. Infectious diseases are different because one person can play an active knowingly or unknowingly in transmitting Ebola, malaria to another person. These diseases fall under the purview of government. If a carrier of an infectious disease poses an active threat to the individual rights of other people, to their freedom to pursue their own lives and happiness, government should coercively intervene to end that threat. This is government's fundamental role in combating the threat from infectious disease. Now, I've got to be honest, I'm not 100% sure where they're going with this, and I am a little bit concerned. But we'll see where this goes. Government's responsibility, of course, do not end there, since the military must maintain a level of readiness which an outbreak of an infectious disease can jeopardize. This must be monitored. U.S. Navy ships, for instance, were partially incapacitated because of outbreak of SARS-CoV-2. In April, the Defense Secretary said that it was hard to say whether Iran and Russia were probing for U.S. military vulnerabilities caused by the pandemic. Militarily, we must also be prepared for bioterrorism and biological warfare, for the deliberate engineering and release of deadly substances and novel infectious pathogens. This requires the capabilities to test, track, and mount appropriate countermeasures, like the use of masks and other personal protective equipment and the ability to treat exposed individuals. I get a fly here and there. We must also be prepared for bioterrorism. This requires the capabilities to test, track, and mount appropriate countermeasures like the use of masks and other personal protective equipment. Of this pandemic is that our federal government's chaotic, under-resourced response suggests that as a nation we are not well prepared for biological attack. But let's leave the military issues aside to focus on naturally occurring or accidentally created infectious pathogens like SARS-CoV-2. Here, government has two basic responsibilities. It must specify when an infectious disease rises to a level severe enough to warrant coercive intervention. And when the threat from an infectious disease is severe enough, it must act to end the threat posed by carriers. Now, I'm going to straight out say that coercive intervention means the use of physical force. I don't know if that's where they're going with this, but that's where it seems like where they're going with this. Not every carrier of an infectious disease should be, in law, be considered an active threat to the rights of others. Those who spread the common cold viruses in restaurants and grocery stores, for example, harm other people. The result of catching the cold is often temporary loss of productivity and reduced enjoyment of life. But we don't coercively restrict the movements and activities of people carrying these viruses. The threat they pose is correctly judged not of sufficient severity to warrant legal intervention. I think that's where they're going, folks. I think that's where they're going. But like I said, I don't completely agree with this, but we are going to go. I was going to do this at 30 minutes, but we're going to trudge through this. And at the end, feel free to comment wherever you want. This will be posted, I'm sure, in Golden State Libertarians, and it will probably be shared on the page. So feel free to go on the page and basically say what you think. Being infected by other people with a common cold virus is one of the risks living among other people, with the risk obviously higher in more densely populated areas like Manhattan. For the common cold, the burden of action falls on those of us seeking to avoid getting sick. We can take preventative measures like washing our hands more often or banning patrons from our store or restaurant because they seem ill. But the carrier of the common cold is not legally obligated to self-isolate until no longer contagious. Even for an infectious disease like influenza, the normal seasonal varieties of the virus is not judged severe enough to legally restrict the activities of carriers, even though it results in significant hospitalizations and death each year. Non-carriers, again, bear the responsibility for taking countermeasures. We can, for instance, choose to avoid people in the winter months who seem feverish, and we can choose to get the flu vaccine. The burden of action falls on us, and this is so despite the fact that countermeasures like the flu shot are not 100% effective. In order properly to delimit government's coercive powers to combat the threat from existing and novel infectious diseases, therefore, the first step is to define, with the aid of medical experts, the criteria for when an infectious disease is of sufficient severity to warrant legal intervention. The common cold obviously falls well below the threshold. Ebola obviously lies far above it. There will no doubt be some borderline cases, as there are with most legal criteria, but those don't erase the fact that there will be many clear-cut cases. Here are at least some of the interrelated factors that are relevant to defining whether an infectious disease warrants legal intervention. How contagious is the disease? Does it require, for instance, prolonged contact with the carrier before risk of transmission? Is it more like chickenpox or the measles, which transmit more and much more readily? By what means is the disease transmitted? Is a respiratory virus like influenza or SARS-CoV-2, or transmitted through human waste like cholera, or sexually transmitted like HIV, or transmitted by animal vectors such as rats or mosquitoes like the plague, malaria, and Zika. What kind of damage can it do when a person contracts it? How destructive and deadly is it on average and in the worst cases? Does treatment often require hospitalization or pharmaceutical interventions? For how long and with what degree of success and side effects? When a person recovers, is it normally a full recovery or are there long-lasting impairments? How much immunity exists in the population? Relevant to how we view the seasonal flu, for instance, is the fact that we build immunity over time, which is why children get the seasonal flu more often than do adults. By contrast, part of the threat of a novel influenza virus is that there would be not to be as much immunity to it. What preventative countermeasures are known and easy to implement? Obviously, this is a scientific, technological, and economic issue, the details of which will change over time and to which the law should adjust. Does something inexpensive and easy to implement, like hand washing with soap, for example, kill the pathogen? Is it relatively easy for people to identify the carrier of the infectious disease? Are there many asymptomatic carriers? Is it relatively easy to spot someone with bacterial pink eye, for instance? Is it relatively hard to identify someone with HIV? Is it easy to avoid risky interaction with the carrier? Is it relatively difficult to avoid interaction with someone with measles because the virus can linger in the air? You may not know someone with measles was in the restaurant 15 minutes before you arrived. By contrast, it's relatively easy to avoid risky interaction with someone you know is a carrier of HIV because the disease is sexually transmitted. Or to take another relevant factor, are there vaccines or preventative drugs like malaria pills available for purchase? How effective are they, and for what side effects, or say, can the animal vector like rats and mosquitoes be easily avoided or killed? There are some of the main considerations that would go into formulating the criteria by which infectious disease will be judged to warrant or not warrant coercive legal intervention. The basic issue is to define when coercive action against the carrier of an infectious disease is warranted because the threat he poses to others is severe enough. You allow government officials to know whether it is, say, appropriate coercively to require the individual carrier of influenza to isolate at home until no longer contagious, or to ban containers of standing water that are potential breeding grounds for Zika transmitting mosquitoes, or to quarantine an entire household when a member has been exposed to someone infected with SARS-CoV-2. In formulating these criteria, the law should catalog existing infectious diseases like the common cold, seasonal influenza, chickenpox, HIV, malaria, measles, cholera, Ebola, Zika. It should explain which rise above the threshold for coercive. God, I'm having problems saying coercive. I'll be honest. Coercive legal interventions which do not, and why when a new infectious pathogen and disease emerges like SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19, this catalog will serve as a crucial frame of reference. This kind of catalog is what the 2017 CDC guidelines offer are different strands of influenza virus, all the way to the most severe known case of 1918 flu pandemic, depending on the existing evidence of the severity of the season flu strains in comparison to past strains. The CDC recommends different NPIs. So in the case of SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19, legally the first responsibility of government would have been to determine, using the scientific data available, what the novel pathogen and novel disease are most like. This in turn will help government determine whether the novel coronavirus falls below or above the legal threshold for being an active threat that requires coercive legal intervention. Using the criteria sketched above, SARS-CoV-2, of course, appears sufficiently contagious, damaging, and difficult to avoid, which would present at present not much existing immunity to the population and no known effective pharmaceutical interventions to be placed above the threshold for legal intervention. Now, this is before we had this is before the vaccine. So just a note. This is before the vaccine. This was in June. So it's a little antiquated that way. Using the criteria sketched above, let's see, sorry. Once this predetermination is made, government would have the responsibility to act to neutralize the threat posed by carriers. That's another phrase that is concerning. When we hear the term neutralize, sometimes we are talking about either removing society or removing somebody from the earth. So we're going to see what All right, sorry about that. We had a technical difficulty, and I'm going to continue. I've done a little bit of reading here, and so basically, I kind of want to sum up some of this stuff because I don't want to sit here and read it exactly either, but I was trying to get it as clear as I could. So basically what they're saying is that the government would have known exactly who was a carrier if they had the ability to do that, and then that those people specifically would be isolated. It doesn't seem like they really have an idea of masks, which is strange because masks were a thing that was mentioned. This may be pre-mask, but I don't think so. So then, basically, if the government is unable to isolate most carriers of an infectious disease, the law must leave us free to act. And that when government lacks specific evidence about a threat, it cannot act. So, similar in the case of an infectious disease pandemic, when many people are potential carriers of a virus, but our governments are unable to detect who in fact is and who is not, coercive action is illegitimate. So then if they can't prove it, then they can't do it. So then they could not use that coercive power. I see what they're saying. Rather, government should share the information it does have about the pathogen and its spread, including how much about the virus and the resulting disease is still unknown, in order to help individuals take appropriate countermeasures for their situation, such as increasing the number of times they wash their hands, engaging in social distance, and disinfecting regularly. Some people, especially vulnerable, may choose to self-isolate at home for weeks and months, even quitting their jobs when they have the financial means to do so. As they await more information about the disease and more effective courses of treatment, others will choose different courses of action. Now, that is another one of those things. This is why I have an issue with, and I'll straight out say it, with, I'll say her name, with Mimi Robson, because of the things that she said specifically about my mother and being a teacher. Same thing. This assumes, it says, others will choose different courses of action. That's a lie. That's not somebody choosing a different course of action if they don't have the means to do that. That's not a choice. I'm sorry, but it's not a choice. The choice is not, I'm going to be in a situation where I could put people's lives in jeopardy, or I could not provide for my family. That's not a choice. And then I had to provide for my family, so I still put people's lives in jeopardy. That's not making a choice. The choice is when you have the money and it's available to you. But when it is not, when you're in a situation where you cannot make that choice, then there is a difference. It's the same exact thing that I am irate with the current California director, because on Facebook, she had the audacity to say to me that my mom had a choice, that all teachers have a choice. And if that choice is what? To not provide for her family? That she went and she decided that this was what she was able to do. She was working at that job. She could not just leave that job just because of inconvenience and because they refused to pay her the amount of money that she needed. Now, granted, she had gone into a contract, and that I told you, want to argue that? Fine, I get that. You agree to a contract. You can't say that you didn't agree to that contract. I understand that. But to say to somebody that, oh yeah, you can't live within your means, and to try and change that, it doesn't matter. That's what you agreed to. And we should just blow it off because it was a choice, makes me irate. It makes me angry. and it discounts my mother. And it's personal to me. It's deeply personal. And it's one of the reasons why I have a axe to grind on that note. I didn't say anything after that, but let me tell you, I will never help that person because they said that, because they said that it's okay. Your mother could have chosen something else. It was totally a let them eat cake answer. My mother had arthritis. She was in a situation where, no, actually, there was a point in which all she could do was teach. At a certain age, all she could do was teach, and she was taking care of me, and my father was dying of cancer. And I understand that a lot of times objectivists and libertarians don't want to get emotional, but I'm very emotional about it, and it made me angry. So when these putzes say that it's a choice, others will choose different courses of action, that is a very blind statement. And I'm going to point it out as blind. And I understand I'm going to be sharing this with a lot of libertarians and a lot of people that think differently. And I understand that. But I'm just saying that this is something that people need to understand. Some people do not have a choice. Death or doing what you've always been doing is not a choice. And if you think so, you're wrong. And if you think so, I am your enemy. I'm sorry. Let me rephrase that just like Kevin Shaw did the other day. I am your opponent. And so then it goes on to improper public health goal led to coercive statewide lockdowns. Now, let me explain something to you too, because this is something that's come up. And it wouldn't be an issue to most of the libertarians on here or objectivists on here. But one of the main reasons that I supported, I'm not saying I don't now, but I'm not active really with it. One of the reasons that I supported the idea of, picketing lockdowns is because the governor was clearly not planning on doing anything except for just locking everything down and then kicking the can down the road. And I thought that we needed to say, hey, you need to actually do something. There needs to be some action. You can't just lock everything down and call it a day, because that's not cool. And especially with that governor, because then what did he do? He went out and a night on the town, even though we can't go on a night on the town. It's amazing how some government officials are blind. And I don't have hatred for government officials because I've served in the capacity of a government official. And I understand that from an objective standpoint, from a libertarian standpoint, that's not something that really and well, no, she did. She like Ellsworth Toozy, and she wrote scumbag government officials, but she never thought of somebody who is tried to be a producer as a government official, somebody who is trying to bring about the kind of change that was brought up in her books, like the ability for people to just be left alone. She didn't really give any space for that. So anyway, so the improper public health goal led to coercive state lockdowns. So there was no health goal, so that it led to coercive state lockdowns, which we knew. And then the proper public health goal is for government to protect our right to the pursuit of health. So in other words, that ability to, have that choice if we have the money. Because trust me, so far they're not saying that anything should have been like giving out money. Trust me. I mean, I've been an objectivist for a long time, and I know that the one thing that the Ayn Rand Institute is not going to say is that we should give people money so that way they can keep living. But the thing is, if the government makes a mistake, then the government has to correct the mistake. Simple. The problem is then they're correcting the mistake off the backs of other people. So that's a whole nother issue. I'm not sure what exactly. There's a lot of issues that we're talking about tonight, and feel free to talk about any of them in response. And please try and keep it civil. Like, don't call me up all kinds of names. Because here's the thing, I'm going to tell you right now. Like on YouTube, I think I can't delete it, but I will say this on Facebook posts and on my page. If your response is, well, I guess you're a libtard, then I'm just going to delete you. That's all I'm going to do. Because you're not adding anything to the conversation, and I'm just not going to have it. And if you're going to say that, you're a conservative snowflake, I'm going to do the same thing. Because I'm here to have conversation. I'm not here to name call. Name calling has no value at all. And it's not reasonable. And, we're trying to do something else here. So basically, let's see. The existence of an uncontained severe infectious disease does not alter this. Okay, let's see. In a free society, the steps taken to mitigate the risk of contracting infectious disease like the seasonal flu are properly regarded as individual private decisions, not governmental ones. Okay, so this is the flu season. If we run a business, we can choose to perform temperature checks during flu season and send home employees running a fever unless, of course, the government controls prevent us from doing so. And if we're an employee, we can seek a job that lets us work from home. See, it's very interesting. It's like you can pursue these things. I mean, if they're not available, I'm saying it. If they're not available, you're fucked. But you have the freedom to pursue these things, which isn't, by the way, a change in policy. If I say, "Oh, you're free to do all these things," and I just lay out what you're free to do, that's not a change in policy. That's a reality that I'm just making clear. It's not a policy brief, really, to be honest with you. The government goal does not become minimizing the number of deaths from a novel coronavirus any more than the discovery of a new form of cancer renders the government's goal to minimize the number of deaths from that cancer. Okay, so basically they're saying that they didn't have the ability to lock us down, and that such decisions are not but a sampling of what the pursuit of happiness looks like with respect to health. Unless incapacitated, no one who values his life will cede authority for their decisions to another person. We consult with trainers, doctors, and therapists to be sure, but we don't let them run our lives. We certainly don't have the moral right to delegate to government the authority collectively and coercively to make such decisions for us all. This is another thing. There are people that were like, I don't understand why you would do this because this is not good for you. Are you against this? Am I against making people do something so that I am better? I really care about my life. Like, I really do. And I'm surprised because, in a way, the rubber met the road on this one because Sometimes I've thought, yeah, I probably would. Because I am self-interested enough, I'd be like, yeah, everybody has to stay home so that I'm not sick. And at the end of the day, I made the decision that that's just not right. I was kind of surprised I did that, but yeah, I understand that there is that within my self-interest versus and with my ethics that they did not agree, and I decided that this was a thing that I was not for, making people do things that they didn't want to do. I'm not for arresting people because they're not wearing masks. I'm not for arresting people because they're not in their home. I'm not for calling people or calling the police on my neighbors who are having a party. All of these things will affect me. All of these things I think I can complain about. But none of these things would I actually use force to make happen. Because I think that that is morally wrong. And even though that could cause severe damage to my health, it's still wrong. So when looking at this means the government's public health goal is not to coercively flatten the curve. So basically they're saying that flattening the curve was not something that they should have been doing. But during pandemic, government must be transparent and explain how government-controlled healthcare will be rationed. Okay, so they need to tell us what they're going to do. And the law should prohibit statewide lockdowns and require governmental transparency. So that's basically what they're saying is that it should have been illegal for lockdown. That's what the government should have done for us, I guess, in practice. Governmental action would have been more strategic, targeted, and effective if our federal state governments knew because codified into law that theirs was the responsibility to test, isolate, and track individual carriers, and that they could not resort to easy but devastating solution of locking down the whole state. So we should have just skipped to the end and talked about that because that's basically what they're saying. Private action would have been more strategic, targeted, and effective. Okay. So basically them making their own decisions. Which I know a lot of my friends would say, and friends on the left would say that they don't trust big companies and governments to stop making money in order to protect themselves. But the reality is, I believe that at some point in time, an entity would probably do that, but I don't know at what point that would be. I think it might have been a little bit too late. I mean, it's kind of hard to say. But if you have ideas on that, feel free to say something. But yeah, private action would have been more but it would have been basically, it would have been their call as to when they thought that was something that needed to occur. I think that there was a trend when, and people forget this, when the masks were first talked about, it was a thing that people were like, they say that we should wear masks, and people were wearing masks way before it was mandated. And I think that, and then requirements for masks were coming up before it was mandated. Like basically, stores were like, yeah, we want you to wear a mask. If you can't wear a mask, then you don't come in. Also, if you look at some of these counties where it hasn't been affected as much. I have a friend that lives in Sun Valley, and he told me about that. Basically, everybody is doing it, just going about their day because they just haven't had any infections in that area, and that's a reasonable response. If you don't have, anybody being affected by this, then why would you have something being done? That doesn't really make any sense. That you would change your actions if it's not a problem. Now, you have a problem if, like, one person comes in, but that's hard to figure out exactly. Maybe at your city area, if you have somebody new come in, then you would swab them. I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know how you would go about doing that. But anyway, this is our first episode of Time to Be Reasonable. I'm Frank. I have a lot of different ways of seeing things. Like I said, I am an activist helping out the Libertarian Party. I was the former on the committee of the Libertarian Party of Los Angeles County. And I don't want to say the wrong term because I don't want Gail Lightfoot to get mad at me. All right. So that is our show. And we will probably shill things later. But I didn't want to do that this first time because I wanted to kind of get an idea of what's going on. And I wanted to talk about this policy brief, which really ends up being a statement of fact. And it's a recommendation for making sure that lockdowns can't occur. And I don't know. And maybe you've read it and you're like, I don't think that's what that said. And I think you misinterpreted it. And that's fine. If you want to come and talk to me about that, that's fine. If you want to have discourse about things, that's fine. If you want to call it name call, go somewhere else. Anyway, I'm Frank. This has been A Time to Be Reasonable. Take care, everybody.